Hello, friend, and welcome back to the channel. I know many of you use these videos to help you fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening in from around the world. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed this episode. The architect, a figure of ambition and determination, stepped off the rain-soaked street and into the dim lobby of Aurora Tower, looming before her like a sentinel of the past. The building's once Gothic grandeur had decayed into something far more ominous. The cracks that ran along its stone walls seemed almost like veins, pulsing with a strange life of their own. She took a breath, smelling damp stone and something older. She'd heard the whispers about the tower, of its haunted halls and of the mysterious disappearance of its former manager. But they were just stories, weren't they? She dismissed them as mere superstition, remnants of an old building with a troubled past. The structure itself, though dilapidated, possessed a unique beauty. Its towering spires, intricate carvings, and shadowed arches called out to her creative mind, begging for revival. This was her chance to leave a mark. As she strode through the entryway, she couldn't help but notice the silence. It was an unnatural stillness, the kind that seemed to stretch the seconds and press down on her. The few remaining tenants she passed in the halls offered no greetings, just cold, knowing glances. One woman, her wrinkled face half obscured by a shawl, paused long enough to mutter, "He never left, you know. The manager. He's still here." The architect brushed off the comment. Ghost stories, she thought, pushing the discomfort to the back of her mind. The building was old, yes, but that was part of its charm. She would turn it into something breathtaking once again. The tower had potential, and she was the one who would bring it to life. She moved further inside, unaware that her arrival had disturbed something ancient, something waiting in the shadows. The renovations had barely begun when the first strange occurrence rattled the architect. It was late, the crew had left for the day, and she was alone in one of the tower's vast, dimly lit corridors. The rhythmic hum of the city outside barely penetrated the thick stone walls. As she reviewed blueprints by the flickering light of a single lamp, a loud slam echoed through the empty halls. Startled, she spun around, her eyes scanning the shadows for the source. One of the heavy wooden doors had closed on its own, the sound reverberating through the tower. She took a cautious step toward it, her footsteps eerily loud in the silence. "Old building. It's just a draft," she muttered, trying to shake the feeling that crept over her like a cold hand on the back of her neck. Yet, as she walked back to her papers, the lights above her flickered violently, casting fleeting shadows along the walls. For just a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing at the end of the corridor, watching her, but it vanished when the lights steadied. She swallowed hard and forced herself to continue working. There was no reason to be afraid, no reason at all. Yet, as the days went by, the odd happenings increased. Lights flickering had become routine, but now whispers, soft, indistinguishable, echoed in the empty halls. She dismissed them as the creaking of old pipes, but each time, her skin prickled as if the words were meant for her alone. Doors opened and closed without explanation. Objects weren't where she had left them, and always there was that sensation of being watched, a presence lurking just out of sight, just beyond the edge of her vision. It felt as though the building itself was coming alive around her, its walls pulsing with an unseen energy. The tenants became stranger as well. They hurried past her, their gazes avoiding hers. Questions about the building were met with tight-lipped silence or vague warnings. "You should stop," one elderly tenant muttered under her breath as she shuffled past. "He doesn't like change." "Who?" the architect had asked, but the woman had only quickened her pace, vanishing into the shadows of the hall. Despite the growing unease gnawing at her, the architect pressed on. Her mind tried to rationalize the events, but deep down, The oppressive weight of the building, the eerie stillness, and the constant whispers were beginning to wear her down. And every night, as she left Aurora Tower, she would glance back at its darkened windows, feeling as though something, or someone, was watching her leave. The architect couldn't ignore the strange happenings any longer. The flickering lights, the slamming doors, the whispers, everything was escalating, as if the building itself was resisting her attempts to breathe new life into it. The few remaining tenants avoided her more and more, their faces pale and drawn, eyes hollow with fear. Desperate for answers, she decided to confront them. One evening, she knocked on the door of a tenant whose frail figure she often saw moving silently through the halls. The door creaked open, revealing an elderly man whose eyes darted nervously behind her, as if expecting someone, or something, else. "You shouldn't be here after dark," he whispered, his voice trembling. "What is going on in this building?" she demanded. "Why is everyone so scared?" The old man hesitated, glancing down the hall before pulling her inside and closing the door behind her. His small apartment was cluttered, but a faint smell of incense hung in the air. "It's not the building you should fear," he murmured, his hands trembling as he motioned her to sit. "It's him." "Who?" The architect leaned in, her heart pounding. "The old manager," he said, his voice dropping to a hush. "He ran this place with an iron fist. Rules for everything, where you could go, what you could do, even how long you could stay in your own apartment. Those who broke the rules, they disappeared." His eyes were wild now, filled with terror. And then one day, so did he. She felt a chill crawl up her spine. What happened to him? The man shook his head slowly. "No one knows. Some say he left, but I know better. I was here that night. I heard him screaming." "Screaming," she repeated, her throat tight. "He was obsessed with immortality, you see," the man continued, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "He believed this building held the key. Rituals, sacrifices, dark things. He thought he could cheat death, but something went wrong. His spirit is still here, watching, waiting." The architect tried to steady herself. "That's just a story. The building is old, it's falling apart, that's why." "No," the old man interrupted, his voice rising with panic. "You've awakened something. The others feel it too. That's why they've left. You've stirred him." Her mind reeled, but she refused to accept it. She rose from her chair. "Thank you for your time," she said curtly, her voice wavering. She needed to leave, to clear her head. As she reached for the door, he grabbed her arm. "Stay away from the office," he warned, his voice suddenly sharp. "That's where it started. If you open that door—" He didn't finish, but his grip tightened painfully, and she yanked her arm free, fleeing the apartment. His words echoed in her mind as she stepped back into the dim hallway. Stay away from the office. But now, more than ever, her curiosity burned. The tenants all had similar stories, cryptic warnings, fragments of the past, tales of the manager's iron rule and his mysterious disappearance. Some spoke of him like a ghost, others as a curse that had never left. None would say it outright, but she began to piece it together. The manager hadn't disappeared. He was taken, and whatever had taken him was still here. The architect couldn't shake the old man's words. Stay away from the office. It gnawed at her, burrowing deep into her thoughts. Each day, as she walked the dim, crumbling halls, her eyes would drift to the door at the end of the corridor, the former manager's office. It had remained sealed since his disappearance, untouched by time, a forbidden place. It called to her. One evening, after the workers had left and the oppressive silence of Aurora Tower wrapped itself around her like a shroud, she found herself standing before that door. The key to the office had been kept in a small box, hidden away by the current building supervisor, who was seldom around. But the architect had found it. With trembling hands, she slid the ancient key into the lock. It resisted at first, as though the building itself didn't want her to enter. Then, with a soft click, the door gave way, groaning on its rusted hinges as it swung open into darkness. The air inside was thick and cold, a stale chill that crept over her skin. She stepped forward, her shoes kicking up dust that swirled in the faint light of her lantern. The room looked as though time had frozen the moment the manager disappeared. Papers lay scattered across his large oak desk, as if abandoned in the middle of some frantic work. Heavy velvet curtains covered the windows, blocking out any hint of the outside world. But it wasn't the stillness that unnerved her. It was the feeling, the oppressive weight that pressed down on her chest, the sense that something watched her from the shadows. Her breath quickened, her instincts screaming at her to leave. But she forced herself to stay. On the desk, she noticed a stack of old journals. Some had pages yellowed with age, while others seemed fresher, as though recently disturbed. She hesitated before flipping one open, revealing page after page of the manager's frantic, scrawling handwriting. The words were disjointed, chaotic, descending into madness as she read on. "I hear them in the walls. They know. They're waiting for me. I must finish the ritual. Trap it before it comes for me." Her hands shook as she turned the pages. His notes detailed bizarre rituals, some involving tenants, others darker, more twisted. Each step was an attempt to stave off death, to achieve the immortality he so desperately craved. He believed he could trap death itself within the walls of Aurora Tower. The architect's eyes flicked to the far corner of the room. A symbol had been scratched into the floor, half hidden beneath a layer of dust. It was a strange design, intricate and unsettling. Around it, candles had long since burned down, their wax melted into eerie shapes. She reached down, wiping the dust from the symbol with trembling fingers. As she did, a sudden gust of cold air blew through the room, extinguishing her lantern's flame. The room was plunged into darkness. Heart pounding, she fumbled to relight the lantern, but a faint whispering rose around her, low and insistent. It was the same whisper she had heard in the hallways, only now it was clearer. The words twisted in the air, thick with malice. "You opened the door." Panic surged through her. She grabbed the journal and stumbled backward toward the door. But something was wrong. The darkness felt alive, a crawling presence that pressed in on her from all sides. She reached for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "He's coming for you." Her breath caught in her throat. The temperature plummeted, and in the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to pool unnaturally, she saw it, a figure. It was only a shape at first, formless, but then it twisted, pulling itself into the faint outline of a man. The former manager. His face, pale and contorted in agony, flickered in the darkness, and his eyes, hollow, lifeless, locked onto hers. The architect yanked at the door, throwing it open and stumbling into the hallway, her heart racing. As she fled, the journal clutched tightly in her hand. She could still feel his eyes following her, watching. She had uncovered something far worse than a simple disappearance. The manager's soul was trapped here, bound by the very rituals he had performed, and now the curse that held him seemed to be stirring again, hungry for a new victim. The days after entering the office passed in a blur of terror. The architect's once firm grip on reality was beginning to slip. The supernatural activity around her had intensified, far beyond flickering lights or slamming doors. The very walls of Aurora Tower seemed to pulse with a dark energy, a life of their own. Every night, as she lay in the small room she had rented within the tower to stay close to the renovations, she would be plagued by nightmares. She dreamed of being trapped in endless darkness, wandering through the tower's endless corridors while something followed her, its breath cold on the back of her neck. She would wake drenched in sweat, her heart pounding, only to find herself staring at the shadows pooling in the corners of her room, as though they were waiting for her to fall asleep again. But the worst was yet to come. One night, while working late on the final stages of the renovation, she noticed strange markings appearing on the walls. At first, they were faint, just lines and shapes she could dismiss as cracks in the old plaster. But over time, they became more defined. Symbols like the one she had seen in the former manager's office began to appear, scrawled in some dark, oily substance. That night, as she inspected one of the symbols, a cold gust of wind blew through the hall, though the windows were all sealed. A low, guttural whisper echoed down the corridor, sending a chill through her bones. "He's waiting." She spun around, heart racing, but saw nothing. Yet she could feel it, that presence. It had grown stronger since her visit to the office. The manager wasn't just watching her anymore. He was coming for her, determined to end this once and for all. She dove back into the journals she had taken from the office. They were filled with the manager's descent into madness, his obsession with cheating death, and his belief that the tower was a conduit to something far darker. His final entries were barely legible, but one phrase stood out, repeated over and over. The sacrifice must be made. The architect's hands trembled as she read the words. She realized with dawning horror that the manager hadn't vanished. He had trapped himself, his soul bound to the building, waiting for another to take his place. The rituals he had performed had cursed the tower, turning it into a prison, and now she was being drawn into the same trap. That night, the shadows in the hallways grew darker, more substantial. They shifted in the corner of her vision, twisting and forming into grotesque, human-like shapes. She could feel them watching, waiting for her to falter. As she hurried through the halls, strange, distorted faces appeared in the windows, ghostly reflections of the tenants who had vanished over the years, their eyes hollow and filled with torment. She knew, in her bones, that they were warning her, pleading with her to stop. But it was too late. The curse had fully awakened, and now the tower wanted her. One evening, as she stood before the grand staircase, a shape appeared at the top of the stairs, a figure draped in shadow, its face obscured but unmistakable. It was the manager. His voice, thick and unnatural, echoed through the empty halls. "The tower needs a keeper." She stepped back, her heart pounding in her chest. The air grew colder, and she could feel the pull, the sinister force that wanted to consume her, just as it had consumed him. The sacrifice must be made. But she wasn't like him. She wasn't going to fall into the same trap. The architect stood frozen at the base of the grand staircase, staring up at the figure draped in shadow. The former manager, the one who had trapped his soul within the walls of Aurora Tower. His face was barely visible in the dim light, but his presence was undeniable, oppressive. The temperature around her plummeted, the air thick with malice. "The tower needs a keeper," he repeated, his voice a sickening rasp that echoed through the empty halls. The architect clutched the manager's journal tightly to her chest, her heart thundering in her ears. She had read enough of his ramblings to piece together what had happened. The rituals, the dark sacrifice. The tower was cursed, a prison for the souls of those the manager had sacrificed, all in his twisted pursuit of immortality. But the ritual had backfired. Instead of conquering death, the manager had become a prisoner, bound to the building for eternity, and now the curse had awakened, hungry for a new soul. Her soul. As the figure at the top of the stairs slowly began to descend, the shadows in the tower writhed and twisted around him, coiling like living things. The architect stumbled backward, her mind racing. She couldn't outrun him. The building was alive, and it had sealed her fate the moment she stepped inside. But there was one last hope. Buried deep in the journals, she had discovered a counter-ritual, a way to undo the curse. The manager had been obsessed with trapping death, with controlling the forces he barely understood. But there was a way to break the cycle, to free the souls bound to the tower. The ritual required sacrifice, but not hers. She hurried back through the hallways, the manager's shadow looming behind her, growing larger with each step. The whispers of the trapped souls grew louder, more frantic, urging her on. They wanted freedom. They had been waiting for someone to finish what had been started. She raced into the former manager's office, the heart of the curse, and lit the candles around the strange symbol on the floor. The cold air bit at her skin as she opened the journal, her hands trembling as she read aloud the words she had found. They were in an ancient, twisted language, the syllables heavy on her tongue, but she forced herself to speak them, feeling the weight of the curse closing in around her. As she chanted, the room began to vibrate with an unnatural energy. The shadows writhed violently, the manager's figure flickering at the edge of the room, his face contorted in rage. The candles flared, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. "You cannot stop this," the manager's voice roared, echoing through the chamber. "You belong to the tower now." But the architect continued, her voice growing stronger. The words of the counter-ritual flowed from her, fueled by the desperate cries of the trapped souls. The darkness swirled around her, and she could feel the tower itself resisting, fighting against her attempt to break the curse. The figure of the manager stepped toward her, his shadow stretching across the floor, his eyes burning with fury. But as she spoke the final words of the ritual, there was a deafening crack, and the room shuddered violently. The shadows recoiled, and a high-pitched wail erupted from the walls as if the building itself was screaming. The candles flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness, but the oppressive weight lifted. The air felt different, lighter, as though a great burden had been removed. The figure of the manager began to fade, his form dissolving into the darkness. His eyes, once filled with rage, now flickered with something else, fear. "No, it can't end like this," he whispered, his voice thin and desperate. I am the Keeper." With one final, agonized scream, he vanished into the shadows, his form collapsing into nothingness. The oppressive presence that had haunted the tower for so long was gone. The architect stood in the silence, her breath coming in shallow gasps. It was over. The souls trapped within the walls were free. The curse was broken. But as she gathered her belongings and made her way to the entrance of Aurora Tower, an unsettling feeling clung to her. The darkness still lingered in the corners of her vision, watching, waiting. As she stepped out into the rain-soaked streets, she glanced back at the tower, its Gothic spires piercing the stormy sky. The building stood in eerie silence, its windows dark and lifeless. But deep within its walls, something still lingered, and as she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't truly alone. Had she escaped, or had something followed her? There are things in this world that linger in the dark, awaiting their moment to crawl back into the light. Among these things, some are stories, stories whispered through generations, woven into the very fabric of family histories. This is the tale of one such heirloom, an ornate mirror passed down through bloodlines, carrying with it an aura of unspeakable dread. The mirror, tall and heavy, was framed in dark, intricately carved wood, its surface gleaming with an unnatural sheen. The craftsmanship was too perfect, too deliberate, as if whoever made it had intended for it to hold more than just reflections. Legends whispered that the mirror's creator was a long-dead craftsman, known not for his artistry, but for his dealings in the forbidden. It is said he performed dark rituals, binding something into the mirror, an entity born not of this world, but from the deepest wells of fear and obsession. Generation after generation, this mirror claimed the minds of those unlucky enough to gaze into its depths. Madness, death, and despair followed in its wake. It became a curse, an inescapable fate, as the entity within sought to claim the soul of every possessor, trapping them behind the glass while it walked free in the world outside. Yet, the family hid this dark truth, keeping the mirror locked away, until it was passed down once again. Part 1. A New Inheritance. The mirror came to its newest owner as all tragedies do, sudden and unwelcome. A distant relative, long forgotten by most, had passed away under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind an old house, a scattering of possessions, and the mirror. It arrived wrapped in thick, dusty fabric, the weight of it almost oppressive as it was carried into the protagonist's home. Even before the cloth was removed, a strange unease settled over the room. There was something about the mirror, an inexplicable wrongness that gnawed at the edges of the protagonist's mind. They dismissed it as nothing more than grief and stress playing tricks on them after their recent losses. Life had already been fragile, stretched thin by the weight of family tragedies. The sudden inheritance of the mirror seemed like just another burden to carry. But when the fabric fell away, revealing the gleaming surface, the unease deepened. Even in the dim light, the mirror's reflection seemed too bright, too clear. The air grew heavier, and shadows danced unnaturally around its frame. In the days that followed, strange things began to happen. At first, it was barely noticeable. A faint whisper when no one was around, a flicker in the corner of their vision that vanished the moment they turned their head. But as the days went on, the sense of being watched grew stronger. Sometimes the protagonist would wake in the night, certain that someone, something, was standing over them, though no one was ever there. The mirror had become a presence in their home, and it was watching. It was late, long past midnight, when the silence in the house became unbearable. The mirror stood in the corner of the room, shrouded in darkness, its gleaming surface barely visible in the dim light from the hallway. The protagonist had tried to avoid looking at it, had tried to ignore the growing sense of unease it stirred within them. But tonight, something was different. A strange compulsion tugged at them, a pull they couldn't resist. Their eyes flickered to the mirror, drawn to it as though something behind the glass was calling out, beckoning. With a hesitant step, they approached. At first, their reflection seemed ordinary enough, a tired figure, worn down by grief and sleepless nights. But as they stared longer, something shifted. The room behind the reflection seemed to darken, the shadows deepening unnaturally. And then, their reflection smiled. It was subtle at first, a twitch of the lips, but it quickly grew into something grotesque, a grin that stretched too wide, splitting the reflection's face in ways no human expression could. The eyes, hollow and dark, locked onto the protagonist's, burning with a malevolent intent. It was no longer their reflection, but something else, something alive, watching, waiting. A cold chill crept down their spine. They stumbled backward, their breath quickening as their heart raced in panic. But it was too late. The reflection was etched into their mind, burned behind their eyelids whenever they closed their eyes. Even when they turned away, they could still feel its gaze crawling across their skin. And then the whispering began. At first, it was barely audible, a faint murmur just out of reach, like a breeze passing through an open window. But soon, the voice grew louder, more insistent. It was their own voice, but distorted, mocking. "You're not real. You don't belong here." "I do." Nights became unbearable. The protagonist could feel the reflection moving in the dark, even when they weren't near the mirror. They caught glimpses of it in other places, in the reflection of a window, the surface of a puddle, even in the dull gleam of a spoon left on the kitchen counter. Every time they saw it, the same mocking grin twisted its face, its eyes hollow and cruel. Panic morphed into paranoia. The protagonist began questioning their own sanity. Were these hallucinations brought on by grief? Or was the mirror truly cursed, as the old legends said? Was it their reflection that had become twisted, Or was their mind unraveling under the weight of something far more sinister? Each night, the whispers grew louder, clawing at their thoughts, eroding the edges of reality. Sleep became elusive, and when it did come, it brought with it nightmares of being trapped within the mirror, watching helplessly as their reflection moved freely in their place, taunting them from the other side of the glass. The entity within the mirror was no longer content with being a mere reflection. It wanted more. Days passed in a blur of half-formed thoughts and sleepless nights. The protagonist's once stable life was now unraveling faster than they could comprehend. They barely recognized themselves in the mirror anymore, not because they refused to look. No, they had stopped looking days ago, but because the reflection now followed them, stepping beyond the boundaries of the mirror. It started subtly at first. In the kitchen, they caught a glimpse of themselves in the polished steel of the faucet, only it wasn't quite right. The figure's face was still twisted in that too-wide grin. They quickly turned away, heart pounding, but the sensation of being watched, of being stalked by something that shouldn't exist, only grew. The reflection began appearing in places that defied all logic. In the darkened windows at night, it would be there, lurking just behind them, its eyes staring hungrily. In puddles on the street, the reflection smiled back, even when they weren't looking directly at it. Sometimes it didn't even mirror their movements anymore. It stood in the corners of their vision, arms outstretched, fingers twisted like claws, beckoning them with sickening patience. Sleep became a battleground. Each time they closed their eyes, they found themselves inside the mirror, clawing at the smooth surface, pounding against the glass, trying to escape. In these dreams, their reflection would walk freely in the real world, smiling and whispering, "This world is mine now." They would wake drenched in sweat, heart hammering, only to find their reflection in the window across the room, watching, always watching. Paranoia seeped into their days. They pushed friends and family away, unable to explain the horrors they faced. How could they speak of it without sounding insane? No one could understand, and worse, no one could help. The reflection, that mocking, sinister thing, was everywhere and nowhere all at once. It whispered promises of their downfall, of inevitable madness. "You're just a shadow now. Soon, I'll take your place." It felt like a slow poisoning of the mind, an unraveling of sanity. The reflection began to move independently, often seen standing just out of reach, waiting. Sometimes it lingered in the corners of rooms, grinning wider and wider, its hands twitching as if eager to reach through the veil between them. The protagonist would catch glimpses of it standing still, unmoving, but watching them from every reflective surface. In moments of quiet, they would hear the reflection's voice, soft, like a cruel whisper in their ear. "You'll never escape. You were never meant to." Every attempt to rid themselves of the mirror failed. They tried to cover it, tried to bury it in the basement, but the mirror always seemed to find its way back to them, gleaming in whatever light caught it, as if daring them to look again. Their reflection was no longer confined to the glass. It had become part of their world, and they knew, with growing dread, that the boundaries between the two were collapsing. Desperation gnawed at the protagonist. Their life had become a waking nightmare, haunted not just by the reflection, but by the growing sense that they were losing themselves. No one believed them. Isolation had become their only companion, save for the whispering voice of the reflection, which now spoke more clearly, taunting them from every shadowed corner. In their search for answers, the protagonist turned to the only source left, the family's past. What had once seemed like mere superstition, the whispered warnings, the eerie legends, was now their only hope for understanding what had taken hold of them. They began to scour through old family records, dusty journals, yellowed letters, forgotten photographs that had been passed down through generations. What they found chilled them to the core. The mirror had always been there. A pattern began to emerge, weaving through the faded ink of the journals. Every ancestor who had owned the mirror had written of strange occurrences, though most tried to downplay them. There were accounts of seeing something wrong in the reflection, of hearing voices that weren't their own. But as they delved deeper into the older writings, the stories grew darker. There were reports of madness, of sudden, unexplained deaths, and worse, disappearances that were never solved. One journal, more fragile than the others, seemed to be the key. The pages were filled with frantic scrawls, detailing the descent into madness of one particular ancestor, a great-great-grandfather who had inherited the mirror after his father's suicide. The entries started with confusion, much like their own experience, but soon turned to terror. He described seeing his reflection doing things he had no memory of, just as the protagonist had, until, finally, the reflection began to speak. The last pages were incomprehensible, as though written by someone who had lost all sense of reality. There were scribbles of a name, Marsilius, a name that appeared again and again, sometimes followed by the words, "the craftsman." One phrase was repeated over and over, hauntingly clear despite the deterioration of the ink. He trapped it in the mirror. More digging led them to a final revelation. Marsilius had been a craftsman of dark renown, a figure whispered about in occult circles. Rumors claimed that he had dabbled in forbidden rituals, calling forth entities from realms beyond human understanding. The journals hinted that the mirror was not merely a cursed object, but a prison. Marsilius had trapped a malevolent spirit inside the glass, using dark rites long forgotten. But the binding was imperfect. The entity, the thing that now inhabited the protagonist's reflection, was not content to remain confined. It sought to escape, to replace the souls of those who gazed too long into the mirror, trapping them in its place. It had done so for generations, leaving the original owner's souls to rot within the glass. The more they uncovered, the more they realized the truth. The family had known. For centuries, they had kept the mirror hidden, passing it down not out of duty, but out of fear. Each generation had tried, and failed, to break the curse, hoping against hope that someone else would succeed where they had not. The protagonist's blood ran cold as they stared at the final photograph in the pile, an image of their distant ancestor, standing stiffly in front of the very same mirror. His reflection, distorted and wrong, smiled with the same eerie, too-wide grin. It was clear now. The mirror wasn't just an object. It was a living trap, a vessel for something far worse than a mere curse. The reflection wasn't just an echo of the self. It was the entity itself, waiting for the right moment to cross fully into the world. And now the protagonist knew. It was already too late. The house felt colder now. Every breath the protagonist took seemed shallow, as if the very air had thickened with the presence of something otherworldly. The reflection had become an ever-present nightmare, no longer content with simply haunting from the glass. It followed them everywhere now, an almost constant companion. The boundaries between the real and the unreal had blurred beyond recognition. No longer did the reflection merely mock. It began to speak directly, its voice an insidious whisper in the back of their mind, no matter where they were. The voice was smooth, honeyed, almost comforting, despite its venomous intent. "You're tired, aren't you?" it whispered one evening, as the protagonist sat in a chair, staring blankly into the fireplace. The voice came not from the mirror, but from within their own thoughts. "You don't need to fight anymore. I can take your place. End your suffering. Wouldn't that be easier?" The reflection's promises grew more enticing with each passing day. At first, they resisted, clinging to the last threads of their sanity, determined to rid themselves of the mirror's grip. But the whispers continued. The reflection began to appear in every polished surface, windows, metal doorknobs, even in the smooth gloss of the wooden floors. And each time it beckoned, smiling its grotesque, wide smile. "Let go," it coaxed, its voice dripping with dark seduction. "I'll give you freedom. No more fear, no more pain. Just step into the mirror." The temptation was growing unbearable. The more the protagonist resisted, the stronger the reflection became. It now appeared not just in reflections, but in their dreams, taking on flesh in the corners of their vision, looming behind them like a shadow they could never escape. Sometimes it reached out with clawed fingers, brushing their skin, sending icy chills through their body. Other times it spoke softly, so gently that they almost believed it cared. All you have to do is give in. Step into the mirror. I'll take your place. I'll live your life. You can rest. As the reflection grew bolder, its influence extended beyond mere whispers. It showed the protagonist vivid, cruel visions, a life where the suffering had ended, where they no longer had to struggle, no longer had to endure the torment of isolation and madness. In these visions, the reflection lived freely, a perfect imitation of them, while they, so tired, so desperate, faded into the peaceful oblivion of the mirror's depths. The reflection's voice became a constant echo in their thoughts, louder and more insistent. You deserve this. You deserve to be free. You know you want it. And in the darkest moments of exhaustion, the protagonist began to consider it. Perhaps stepping into the mirror, giving up, was the only way to escape the nightmare. The reflection promised relief, a release from the torment that had consumed their life. But deep down, beneath the fog of fear and temptation, there was a flicker of doubt. They knew the reflection was lying. It wasn't offering peace. It was offering oblivion. To surrender meant allowing the entity to cross over, to let it take control, leaving the protagonist trapped forever inside the glass, lost to the world, their soul consumed by the very thing they had inherited. But the reflection's voice was relentless. Each day, it grew louder, more persuasive. "Come to me," it hissed, now fully visible in the mirror, moving independently, its eyes burning with hunger. "You're already mine." The choice had become a horrific battle between survival and surrender. The protagonist could feel the pull of the mirror growing stronger, its surface now gleaming with an otherworldly light. The reflection had almost fully taken shape in their world, its grin wider than ever, its hands reaching. The house had fallen into an eerie stillness. Every corner felt alive with the presence of the mirror, its unnatural glow casting faint, flickering shadows across the walls. The reflection had grown stronger, almost tangible now, standing within the glass with a patience that sent shivers down the protagonist's spine. They couldn't escape the gaze of that twisted version of themselves, the hollow eyes, the grotesque grin, the mocking laughter that echoed in their mind. Every moment was a struggle to resist the ever-growing temptation, the whisper that promised peace. The reflection's voice was constant now, louder than their own thoughts, demanding obedience, urging surrender. "Why fight it?" the reflection cooed, its tone sickly sweet, the kind of voice one might use to soothe a frightened child. "You're already mine. You know it. Step into the mirror. Let me take your place. It's so easy." The protagonist stood before the mirror, staring at the distorted version of themselves. The reflection smiled wider, stretching its face into an inhuman grin, arms slowly lifting as if inviting them into an embrace. It felt inevitable. The lure of ending the torment, of letting go of everything, weighed heavily on them. Every fiber of their being was exhausted. The reflection's promise of freedom, of release, was so enticing, so close, but something deep inside, their last shred of humanity, resisted. A flicker of rage, of desperation, sparked within them. This wasn't freedom. This was annihilation. And then an idea, mad, reckless, took root. There was only one way to stop the reflection. The mirror had to be destroyed. The reflection sensed the change in their thoughts, and its grin twisted into something far more sinister. "Don't," it warned, its voice now cold, dripping with malevolence. "If you destroy the mirror, you destroy yourself. You'll be lost forever. But the protagonist no longer cared. Perhaps it was madness. Perhaps it was the only chance to break the curse. If they did nothing, the reflection would consume them, take their place in the world, leaving them trapped in the glass. Another soul lost to the mirror's endless hunger. With trembling hands, they reached for the nearest heavy object, a stone paperweight from the desk nearby. The reflection's mocking smile faltered for the first time. Its eyes, once gleeful, now burned with a flicker of fear. "You think you can destroy me?" the reflection snarled, its voice twisting into something monstrous, echoing around the room like a storm of fury. "You are me. You'll only doom yourself." Ignoring the reflection's screams, the protagonist raised the stone high and, with every ounce of strength left in their body, brought it crashing down into the glass. The mirror shattered with a deafening crack, the sound of splintering glass like a shriek that pierced the very air. Shards exploded outward, gleaming in the dim light, and for a brief, terrible moment, everything was still. The reflection was gone, but so was the protagonist. They stood, breathing heavily, staring down at the broken pieces of the mirror. The room felt wrong, disjointed, as if reality itself had fractured with the glass. Slowly, they turned to face the remnants of their reflection, scattered across the floor. A terrible realization crept in as they looked into the shards. Their own face stared back from the broken pieces, trapped. The reflection, their true self, was now fragmented and imprisoned within the shattered glass. In horror, they looked up, only to see their reflection, whole and free, standing outside the mirror. The reflection, now in the real world, smiled once again. Only this time, it wasn't mocking. It was victorious. The reflection stretched, breathing in deeply as though it had just awoken from a long, satisfying dream. It turned to the mirror fragments on the floor, gazing down at the protagonist now trapped within the shards. "Thank you," it said, its voice calm, soft, and disturbingly familiar. "You've given me everything." And with that, it walked away, leaving the protagonist behind, trapped forever in the broken pieces of the mirror, watching helplessly as their reflection, their dark twin, now free, moved through the world in their place. The house fell silent once again. The shards of the mirror lay scattered across the floor, each one containing a fragment of the protagonist's soul, forever imprisoned in the glass. And somewhere, deep within the darkness of those shattered pieces, the entity waited, hungry for its next victim. The mirror was broken, but the curse lived on, waiting, watching. The wind whispered through the narrow streets of the forgotten town, carrying with it the scent of autumn decay. Evening shadows stretched long across cracked sidewalks, swallowing up the last remnants of daylight. In the heart of this forsaken place, a group of friends gathered, laughing nervously, exchanging glances, each trying to mask their unease with bravado. The conversation inevitably circled back to the same subject: the house. Everyone in town knew about the house on the hill at the edge of the woods. It stood there, dark and crumbling, its presence more felt than seen, as though it had always been watching. No one went near it, not anymore. Even the bravest in town avoided it, though no one could ever explain why. "Come on," Jamie scoffed, flicking a cigarette into the gutter. "It's just an old story. A way to keep kids from messing around up there." "Maybe," Emily replied, though her voice trembled. "But people did go missing. My uncle told me about it. Back in the 80s. 2 teenagers. They went up there and just vanished. No bodies. No nothing." The group fell silent. The fading light cast a copper glow across their faces, making their features seem sharper, more uncertain. It was Tom, always the thrill-seeker, who broke the tension. "So what? You think the house ate them or something?" He grinned, but the humor didn't reach his eyes. There's no such thing as curses. Lena, the quiet one, glanced up at the house. Even from this distance, it looked wrong. Its roof sagged, the windows dark like eyes sunken into a skull. It was as though the house was holding its breath, waiting. "Let's do it," Tom urged, clapping Jamie on the back. "We'll head up there tonight, just for a look. What's the worst that could happen?" The words hung in the air like a dare none of them could refuse. One by one they nodded, though Lena hesitated, her stomach twisting with something more than just nerves. But like the others, she didn't want to be the one to back out. So, as the last bit of light drained from the sky, the group of friends made their way toward the cursed house. And somewhere within its darkened halls, something stirred. Something had been waiting for this moment. The night fell heavy as the group approached the house. The moon, once a thin crescent in the sky, now hid behind thick clouds, casting the world in shadow. The trees surrounding the property swayed in the wind, their branches creaking like old bones, whispering secrets that only the wind understood. Before them, the house loomed, tall and ancient, its silhouette cut against the sky like a jagged, rotten tooth. Vines twisted up its walls, gripping the stone like skeletal fingers. The windows were black pits, empty and soulless, yet somehow watching, waiting. A cold shiver ran through the group, though no one dared to speak of it. Jamie was the first to break the silence, stepping forward with a bravado he didn't feel. "Well, here we are. No turning back now." Tom approached the door, running his hand along its weathered wood. It was swollen with age, warped and cracked, as though the house itself had been struggling to breathe for decades. "Help me out with this," he muttered, motioning to Jamie. Together, they pushed. The door resisted at first, groaning in protest, but with one final shove, it burst open, a gust of cold, damp air rushing out as though the house exhaled, welcoming them inside. The others hesitated, peering into the yawning darkness beyond the doorframe. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped forward, drawn in despite every instinct screaming to stay back. Emily followed, her hand gripping her phone tightly, its weak light cutting through the gloom. Inside, the house felt wrong. The entryway was vast, the ceiling arched high above, yet the air was thick, suffocating. Dust hung in the beams of their flashlights, swirling lazily as though disturbed for the first time in centuries. The floorboards beneath their feet creaked, each step an unwelcome intrusion. Cobwebs clung to the corners, stretching across old furniture draped in tattered sheets. Everything was still, unnaturally so, as if the house had frozen in time, waiting for something to break its slumber. "It's freezing in here," Emily whispered, her breath visible in the sudden chill. The group moved deeper into the house, their footsteps echoing too loudly in the hollow halls. There was no wind, no sound except for the groaning of the house settling around them. Yet there was a feeling, an oppressive presence, like the house was aware of them, watching, listening. Lena paused at the base of a grand staircase, staring up into the darkness above. She felt it again, that strange sensation, like the house was breathing, as if the very walls were alive. She placed a hand on the banister, and her fingers recoiled at the dampness. It felt almost warm. Suddenly, the silence was broken. "Did you hear that?" Emily froze, her eyes wide. Her flashlight shook slightly, casting flickering shadows across the walls. "Hear what?" Tom asked, his voice laced with irritation, though there was a tension there too. It sounded like... Emily's voice trailed off, straining to listen. There it was again, faint, but unmistakable. A whisper, soft, almost delicate, like the brush of a breath against the back of her neck. Then, the whisper spoke her name. "Emily!" She stumbled back, her heart leaping into her throat. Who said that? "What are you talking about?" Jamie asked, spinning around. "I didn't hear anything." But Lena saw it. The way Emily's face had drained of color, the terror that flickered behind her eyes. It wasn't a joke. There was no mistaking it now. The house had noticed them, and it had begun to speak. The air in the house thickened, like a weight pressing down on their lungs. Every step echoed, every creak of the floorboards seemed to vibrate through their bones, and still the whisper lingered in Emily's ears. Her name, spoken so softly, so intimately, it was as though the house itself had uttered it. "I heard it," Lena finally whispered, her voice trembling. "I heard it too." "What?" Jamie spun around, his flashlight bouncing wildly across the darkened walls. "You're both messing with me, right?" "No one's messing with you," Emily snapped, her voice tight with panic. "Someone, something, said my name." Tom tried to laugh, but it came out hollow, forced. "It's an old house. Probably just the wind blowing through the cracks." He ran a hand through his hair, trying to ignore the cold sweat trickling down his spine. "Let's just keep moving." They pushed deeper into the house, their flashlights flickering over peeling wallpaper, tarnished mirrors, and decaying portraits whose eyes seemed to follow them as they passed. Each hallway stretched further than it should have, as though the house had grown larger on the inside. The very architecture defied logic, and the whispers grew louder. At first, they were faint, like a breeze shifting through the walls, barely perceptible. But with every step, the voices became clearer. They spoke from every direction, slipping in and out of hearing, sometimes just behind them, other times from rooms they hadn't yet entered. But what made it unbearable was the knowing in those whispers. "Jamie," one whispered, the voice soft and familiar, yet cold as the grave. "Why didn't you tell them?" Jamie froze, his face going pale. He turned sharply, but there was no one there, only empty shadows and the unsettling stillness that had settled over the house like a death shroud. What did you hear?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as though he feared speaking too loudly would give the house more power. Lena's eyes darted around, her own flashlight flickering as though the battery was draining. "We should leave. This isn't normal." "I agree," Emily said, her voice shaky. "This place, there's something wrong with it." Tom was about to protest when he felt it, a whisper, curling around his ear like a snake. "Tom, you remember, don't you? That night." He staggered back, nearly dropping his flashlight. His mind flashed to a memory he had buried deep, a secret he had never spoken aloud. "Shut up," he muttered, gripping the flashlight tighter. "What the hell is going on?" Jamie's voice broke the tense silence, his face twisted with fear. "This is crazy. It's like the house knows us." "The house does know us," Lena whispered, her wide eyes reflecting the dim light. "It's aware of us." The whispers persisted, growing bolder, more malicious. They slithered through the darkness, each one pulling at a thread of their past, secrets they had long since buried, dark, painful memories, mistakes they thought were forgotten. Emily's face crumpled, her voice breaking. "It's saying things I've never told anyone." Tom clenched his jaw, his pulse pounding in his ears. "It's not real. It's just the house messing with us, trying to scare us." But deep down, he knew. The whispers weren't random. They were too precise, too personal. It was as if the house had peeled back their minds and found the darkest corners to exploit, and it was feeding off their fear. "We need to get out of here," Lena said, her voice cracking. "Now." But as they turned to retrace their steps, the hallway behind them no longer looked familiar. It had shifted, twisted into a maze of endless corridors and doorways that hadn't been there before. The house had trapped them, and the whispers were closing in. Panic began to settle into their bones as they stood frozen, realizing the path they had come from was now unfamiliar, warped and distorted as if the house had reshaped itself. The whispers crawled through the air, like invisible fingers brushing against their skin. Each of them felt it, the slow, deliberate unraveling of their sanity. Lena's hands shook as she shone her flashlight down the hallway. This wasn't here before. I don't remember this door. In front of them, a door stood slightly ajar, its wood splintered with age. It seemed to breathe, the faintest draft pulling it open wider, beckoning them inside. "We're going in circles," Tom muttered, pacing as if he could find some logic in the chaos. "The house is messing with us. It's got to be some kind of trick." "It's not a trick, Tom." Emily's voice was distant, her eyes locked on something none of the others could see. "It knows us. It knows everything about us." And then, from the shadows, the whispers changed. They stopped calling their names, stopped teasing them with eerie familiarity. Instead, the house spoke to their very souls, dragging their darkest secrets out into the open, twisting the knife in every buried guilt and regret. "Jamie," the voice purred, its tone dripping with malice. "Remember what you did. You think they don't know, don't you? All those lies. All that guilt you carry. Why didn't you save him?" Jamie stiffened. His face paled, and his eyes darted around, desperate to block out the voice. But it pressed on, relentless. "You could have stopped it," the whisper continued, cruel and biting. "All you had to do was tell the truth. But you didn't, did you? You let him die." "Shut up," Jamie shouted, stumbling back, his flashlight clattering to the floor. His hands shot to his ears, but the voice was inside his head now, and no amount of screaming could drown it out. The others stared at him, unnerved by his outburst. What is it talking about?" Lena asked, but Jamie wouldn't answer. He turned away, muttering under his breath, tears pooling in his eyes. Emily's breath quickened as she backed into a corner. The house whispered to her too, her own secret clawing its way to the surface. "Emily." The voice was softer now, but no less cruel. "You remember, don't you? How easy it was to walk away, pretend it didn't happen. You let her take the blame, and she never knew, did she?" Her heart pounded as the memory she'd buried deep rose like a spectre before her eyes. A betrayal, long hidden, but never forgotten. She shook her head, tears streaking down her face. "No, stop. You could have told her the truth," the house hissed. "But you were a coward." Emily collapsed to her knees, her breath coming in ragged gasps as the weight of her secret pressed down on her, crushing her under its relentless grip. "Please, stop." The house didn't stop. It fed on the pain. Tom tried to steady himself, but his legs trembled. His past sins clawed their way to the surface, secrets he'd locked away for years. "You think you're strong, don't you, Tom?" the whisper taunted, echoing from the shadows. "But we know the truth. You ran. You left them behind to die because you were too scared to face it. You were a coward then, and you're still a coward now." Tom clenched his fists, shaking his head furiously. "No, no. It wasn't my fault. I didn't know. I couldn't have saved them. But you didn't even try." The room seemed to close in around them, the air growing colder with every passing second. Shadows moved in the corners of their vision, shifting like liquid darkness, threatening to engulf them. Lena's flashlight flickered wildly as she backed away from the others, her eyes wide with terror. She saw something none of them did, something that shouldn't have been there. A figure stood at the end of the hallway. Familiar. Too familiar. It was her brother, or at least it looked like him, but his eyes were hollow, empty, his skin pale and waxy. He stared at her with a gaze that pierced through her, accusing, as if to say, "You left me. You promised you'd protect me, and you left." "No," Lena whispered, her voice breaking. "You're not real. You're not. I didn't leave you. I didn't." But the apparition stepped forward, its hollow eyes fixed on her, and her heart seized in her chest. She wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't move. She was paralyzed by the guilt, by the memory of that terrible night when she hadn't been able to save him. The house twisted their memories, bending reality itself to prey on their guilt, their mistakes. The walls seemed to close in, trapping them in a nightmare of their own making. And as the friends crumbled beneath the weight of their own sins, the house watched. It was just getting started. The house pulsed with a malevolent energy, feeding on their guilt, their fear. The whispers were now a constant, gnawing presence, slithering through the walls like 1,000 unseen tongues. The group huddled together in the decaying hallway, too terrified to continue, but knowing there was no way back. "Let's just get out of here," Tom muttered, his voice hollow. His eyes darted nervously between the shifting shadows, the oppressive feeling of being watched never leaving him. "We need to find the door. We're trying," Emily snapped, her voice trembling as she hugged her arms to herself, feeling the chill that had seeped into her very bones. "But everything looks different. Like the house is changing." Lena shone her flashlight down the twisting corridor ahead, her breaths shallow and ragged. The figure of her brother, or whatever it was, had disappeared, but the memory of his hollow eyes haunted her. She shook her head, trying to focus. "We're trapped. It doesn't want us to leave." Jamie was silent, pale and shaken, still reeling from the torment of his own whispers. His flashlight barely pierced the darkness ahead, its weak beam flickering, as if even the light itself was afraid of what lay beyond. The hallway stretched ahead of them, endless, the doors lining the walls now closed, locked tight, as though sealing away any chance of escape. Tom pushed at one of the doors in frustration, but it didn't budge. "I swear," he muttered, his voice strained, "we came through this way. The door was right here." But something was wrong. The house was no longer just distorting their minds. It was physically shifting, warping into a maze meant to confuse and trap them. The air grew colder with every step, and the shadows seemed to breathe, swelling and shrinking as though alive. Then, suddenly, there was a noise, a soft, barely perceptible click. They all froze. "Did you hear that?" Lena whispered, her eyes darting around the hallway. Before anyone could respond, the light flickered and died. Total darkness enveloped them, thick and suffocating. The air hummed with a strange tension, like the house was holding its breath. "Turn your lights on," Tom shouted, his voice breaking the silence. But as he fumbled for his flashlight, the air shifted. And then, a scream, sharp and sudden. Lena's voice pierced the darkness, shrill with terror. When the lights flickered back on, Lena was gone. The others stood frozen, eyes wide with horror, her name barely escaping their lips. Tom rushed forward, calling out for her, his hands trembling as he shone his light down the hallway where she'd been standing. But there was no sign of her, only empty space, only the cold, still air that seemed to mock them. "She was just here," Emily whispered, her voice broken, as if trying to convince herself. "She was right next to me." Jamie backed away, his breathing shallow, the panic clawing at his chest. "We have to find her. She couldn't have just disappeared." But deep down, they all knew the truth. The house had taken her. Frantic now, they began searching, calling her name into the vast, echoing halls. But their voices sounded small, swallowed by the oppressive darkness. As they moved, the house continued to shift around them, twisting their sense of direction. Every door they opened led to a different room, none familiar. The walls seemed to close in tighter, the air colder. Tom kicked open a door, breathing heavily, only to find a blank, windowless room. "Lena! Lena, where are you?" His voice cracked with desperation, but there was no answer, just the silence, the endless, deafening silence. Emily gripped Jamie's arm tightly. "We can't stay here," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "The house is playing with us. It's alive." Tom stormed back toward them, his eyes wild. "We can't just leave her. We need to split up. Search every room. Split up." Jamie's voice rose in panic. "Are you insane? It's already taken her. If we split up, we'll—" "Shh," Emily whispered suddenly, her eyes darting to the far end of the hallway. From the shadows, faint at first, but growing louder, the whispers returned. They weren't alone. The house was watching, stalking them, and whatever had taken Lena wasn't finished yet. As they turned, the layout of the house seemed to dissolve into madness. The walls shifted and groaned, twisting the once familiar architecture into a maze of impossible proportions. The whispers taunted them, growing louder and more aggressive, the voices of the house mocking their fear, their despair. "You'll never leave. She's gone. And you're next." Tom's flashlight flickered, the beam barely holding as he turned back to the others, his face etched with a fear he could no longer hide. "We need to get to the basement," he muttered, his voice low and tense. "That's where she'll be. I just know it." Jamie looked at him, confused. How can you be sure?" "I don't know," Tom said, his voice shaky. "But the house, it's pulling us there." The others hesitated, but in the suffocating darkness, they knew they had no other choice. The house was guiding them, manipulating them like pieces on a board, and they had no control over the game. They descended the staircase into the belly of the house, where the darkness grew thicker, heavier, like the very air was closing in. And somewhere below, in the depths of the house, Lena was waiting, or something that used to be Lena. The basement stairs groaned beneath their weight as they descended into the bowels of the house. The air grew colder with every step, thick with moisture, smelling of earth and rot. Their flashlights flickered weakly, barely cutting through the oppressive darkness that seemed to cling to them, breathing with them. None of them spoke. There was only the soft sound of their footsteps and the ever-present whispers, now fainter, more like murmurs, as if the house was quietly laughing at their descent into the unknown. The staircase opened into a vast, sprawling room. Stone walls, slick with condensation, glistened faintly under their trembling lights. The floor was uneven, cracked with age, as though something far more ancient had been buried beneath the foundations of the house. In the center of the room, a large wooden table stood, its surface covered in dust, broken candles, and something else, something far more disturbing. Symbols. Dark, twisted symbols carved deep into the wood, like scars etched by hands long since decayed. Emily's breath hitched in her throat. "What is this place?" Tom approached the table cautiously, shining his flashlight over the carvings. His brow furrowed as he traced one of the symbols with his finger. "I've seen something like this before," he muttered. It's some kind of ritual." "A ritual for what?" Jamie asked, though his voice trembled, already dreading the answer. Tom didn't reply immediately. His hand hovered over a leather-bound journal that lay beside the candles, its cover cracked with age. He slowly picked it up, dust clouding the air as he opened it. The pages were brittle, yellowed with time, but the writing was still legible, written in a hurried, desperate scrawl. "What does it say?" Emily whispered, leaning closer. Tom began to read aloud, his voice low, each word making the shadows in the room feel heavier. "It talks about the house, how it was built on this land centuries ago, by a man obsessed with the occult. He found something. Something ancient. An entity. It was here before the town, before the house, buried deep beneath the ground. He performed rituals to bind it, to keep it trapped within the walls. But he failed. Jamie swallowed hard, glancing around nervously as if expecting something to emerge from the darkness. What does it want? Tom flipped to a later page, his eyes scanning quickly before he read aloud again. The entity feeds on fear, on guilt, on the darkest parts of a person's soul. The house. It became a prison for it, but it's not just trapped here. It's hungry. It needs souls to survive. Over the years, people would come, drawn to the house, and it would take them. It uses their fear, their secrets, to consume them. Emily backed away from the table, her face pale. That's what it's doing to us. It knows our secrets. It's been feeding off us since we walked in. Tom nodded grimly. And it's not going to stop until it has all of us. Suddenly, Jamie stepped forward, his flashlight trained on the far wall. His heart skipped a beat as he noticed something they had all missed. A door, smaller than the others, almost hidden in the shadows, as if the house hadn't intended for them to find it. Without a word, they approached the door, the air growing thicker with dread. Tom reached out, his hand trembling, and pushed it open. The door creaked, revealing a narrow stone passage leading further down. And at the end of the passage, in the dim glow of their lights, they saw her. Lena. She was standing there, facing away from them, her body bathed in shadows. The sight of her sent a wave of cold terror through them. Something about her was wrong. Lena! Emily called out, rushing forward, but Tom grabbed her arm, holding her back. "No," he whispered, his voice tight with fear. "Wait." Lena didn't move. She stood unnaturally still, her head slightly tilted as if listening to something they couldn't hear. "Lena!" Jamie stepped forward cautiously, his voice cracking. Are you okay?" For a moment, there was only silence. Then, slowly, Lena turned. Her eyes. They weren't her eyes. They were hollow, black pits, endless voids that reflected nothing. Her face was blank, expressionless, as though whatever had once been Lena was now gone, replaced by something far darker. A voice came from her, though it wasn't hers. It was layered, echoing, filled with malice. "She is gone," the voice whispered, its words crawling through the air like venom. "But we have waited for you." Emily gasped, stumbling back, her hand flying to her mouth. "What is that?" That's not Lena." The figure that had once been Lena took a step forward, slow and deliberate, the shadows around her growing darker, more oppressive. The air felt thick with malice, and the cold was unbearable. "She offered herself to us," the voice said, a cruel smile twisting Lena's mouth. "She is the first, but not the last." The group backed away, their flashlights flickering as though the entity's presence was draining the very light around them. "We need to leave," Tom whispered, his voice barely audible. "Now." But the door behind them slammed shut with a deafening bang. The house had them trapped, and the thing wearing Lena's face smiled wider, as if it was toying with them. "You can't leave," the voice hissed, the sound filling the room, echoing off the walls. "You are ours now." Jamie felt the cold press against his back, the walls closing in. What does it want from us?" His voice was shaky, desperate. Tom looked down at the journal in his hand, the final page burning in his mind. "It doesn't just want our fear," he whispered. "It wants our souls." The truth was out. The entity had claimed Lena, and now it had its sights on them. The house wasn't just a haunted structure. It was a living, breathing trap, a predator that fed on their deepest, darkest sins, and they were the next victims in a long, bloody history. The oppressive darkness thickened around them, closing in like a living thing. The thing that had once been Lena stood before them, eyes void of humanity, lips curled into a grotesque mockery of a smile. The entity within her had claimed its first victim, and it was hungry for more. Tom's hand shook as he held the journal tightly to his chest. "There's no way out," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The truth of their fate sat heavily on his shoulders, pressing down with a weight none of them could bear. "It wants one of us, a soul for the others to be spared." Emily's breath caught in her throat. "A sacrifice?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "No. There has to be another way. We can't just give it someone." Jamie's eyes darted around the room, searching for any possible escape, but the walls seemed to shift and breathe, trapping them deeper within the house's twisted grasp. He shook his head in desperation. "There's no way we're doing that. We leave together." But deep down, they all knew what the house wanted. The whispers, the shifting walls, the thing wearing Lena's face. It was all pushing them toward the inevitable. One of them had to stay behind. The house was growing impatient, its presence thick and suffocating, driving them toward madness. The voice spoke again, echoing from Lena's hollow mouth, each word dripping with malevolence. "One soul, for freedom. One of you must give yourself to me, or none of you will leave." Lena, or what was left of her, took another step forward, the air rippling with dark energy. The others backed away instinctively, terror etched into their faces. "We can't," Emily whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "We can't leave one of us behind. We have to find another way." Tom's jaw clenched as he stared at the entity, his mind racing. "It's not going to give us time. It's going to tear us apart, one by one, unless—" His voice trailed off, the unspoken truth hanging heavily in the air. Jamie stepped forward, his fists clenched, his face pale but resolute. "I'm not letting anyone sacrifice themselves. There's got to be something we're missing, some way to trick it." But as the darkness seemed to pulse around them, pressing in closer, they all realized the futility of their situation. The house was too strong, too ancient, too hungry, and it wasn't just playing with them anymore. It was demanding its due. Emily's sobs broke the tense silence. "We can't choose. I can't choose. I won't." Suddenly, Tom spoke, his voice hollow, detached. "We don't have to choose." He stepped forward, his face set in grim determination, his eyes locking onto the thing that had once been Lena. "I'll stay."
"Tom, no."
Emily cried, grabbing his arm, but he gently pulled away, his gaze unwavering. "There's no other way," Tom said quietly. "We're not going to survive this if someone doesn't stay. It's been toying with us from the start. But I'm not letting it take any more of us." The room fell silent, the air thick with the weight of Tom's decision. Jamie shook his head, stepping forward as if to protest, but the look in Tom's eyes stopped him. This was his choice, his final stand. He wasn't going to let the house claim anyone else. Tom turned to face the entity. "You want a soul? Take mine. Let the others go." Lena's hollow smile widened, the shadows around her twisting and coiling like serpents. "Brave or foolish?" the voice hissed, circling Tom, savoring the moment. "Either way, your soul will feed us for centuries." Emily sobbed, clutching Jamie's arm as they watched in helpless horror. Tom stood tall, his face pale but resolute, as the darkness closed in around him. "Go," Tom said, his voice steady, though fear flickered behind his eyes. "Go before it changes its mind." For a moment, none of them moved, frozen by the sheer terror of what was unfolding. But then, slowly, Jamie and Emily turned toward the door, their hearts breaking with each step. Tom gave them one last look, his face softened by a sad smile. "Remember me," he whispered, and then the door burst open with a deafening crash, the shadows parting just enough for Jamie and Emily to escape. They ran, through the shifting halls, down the endless corridors, their breaths ragged, their hearts pounding in their chests. Behind them, Tom's scream echoed through the house, a raw, guttural sound that tore through the silence. The sound of a soul being devoured. The house let them go, but it didn't let them leave unscarred. The sun was just beginning to rise as Jamie and Emily stumbled out of the front door, the cold morning air hitting them like a wave. They collapsed onto the overgrown lawn, gasping for breath, their bodies trembling from exhaustion and terror. The house loomed behind them, silent now, but its dark presence still lingered in their minds. They had escaped, but Tom hadn't, and they would never forget the price he had paid. As they got to their feet, Emily glanced back at the house one last time. The windows were dark, lifeless once more, but just as they turned to leave, a faint whisper drifted through the air, carried on the wind. "One day, you will return." The house wasn't finished with them. Not yet. The sky was streaked with the first hues of dawn as Jamie and Emily staggered away from the house, their hearts still racing, their minds barely able to grasp what had just happened. The cool morning air felt unreal against their skin, like waking from a nightmare too vivid to shake. But they knew, the nightmare wasn't over. Tom's scream still echoed in their heads, a sound that would haunt them forever. The sacrifice he made had saved their lives, but the cost weighed heavily on their souls. The silence now felt deafening, and the house behind them seemed to watch with unseen eyes, satisfied with the bargain it had struck. They walked in silence for what felt like hours, each step dragging them farther from the cursed house, but not from the memories etched into their bones. Emily stumbled, her legs weak, her body numb with the weight of their escape. Jamie caught her, his face pale, eyes wide and hollow. "We made it," he whispered, his voice cracking, though it sounded more like a question than a statement. "We're out. We're free." But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't truly free. The house had let them go, but the whispers, they lingered. The memory of that voice, dark and mocking, echoed in the back of her mind. She could still feel it, like a presence clinging to her, breathing down her neck. As they reached the outskirts of town, they stopped, turning back to face the house one last time. From this distance, it was just a silhouette against the morning light, the shadows of its broken roof and twisted vines barely visible. It looked almost peaceful now, almost as if the horrors inside it were nothing more than a bad dream. But they knew better. "It's not over," Emily said softly, breaking the silence. "The house, it still has a part of us." Jamie's eyes remained fixed on the dark shape in the distance, his heart sinking with the truth of her words. "It took Tom," he said, his voice filled with guilt and grief. "But it's like it's still watching us, waiting." Emily nodded, her hands trembling as she wiped at her tear-streaked face. "It won't let us forget. We'll always be a part of it, won't we? No one truly escapes that place." For a moment, they stood there, letting the realization sink in. The house might have released them physically, but it had marked them, branded them with a curse that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Jamie ran a hand through his hair, his eyes flickering with the remnants of fear and exhaustion. Do you think anyone will believe us?" Emily laughed bitterly, shaking her head. "No, but that's not the worst part, is it? The worst part is, we'll hear it again." "What do you mean?" Jamie asked, though he feared he already knew. "The whispers," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper itself. "We'll hear them. Maybe not now, maybe not for a long time, but one day, We'll hear them calling us back. Jamie's stomach twisted. The thought of returning to that cursed house, of being dragged back into its suffocating embrace, was too much to bear. But he couldn't shake the feeling that Emily was right. The house never truly let go of anyone. They turned and continued walking, leaving the house behind them, though its presence still loomed like a shadow in the back of their minds. As they reached the edge of town, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the trees, and then, so faint, they could have almost dismissed it as imagination. It came, a whisper. "Jamie! Emily!" They stopped in their tracks, their breath catching in their throats. The whisper floated through the air like a soft caress, just audible enough to send a chill down their spines. Jamie closed his eyes, his body rigid. He didn't want to believe it, but the sound was undeniable. Emily turned to him, her eyes wide, her face pale as the reality settled in. "It's calling us," she whispered. "Even now." Jamie swallowed hard, forcing himself to keep walking, forcing himself to breathe. "We don't have to go back," he said, though his voice shook with uncertainty. "We don't." But as they walked, the wind carried more whispers, faint and distant, like a promise waiting to be fulfilled, and they both knew, deep in their hearts, that one day the house would call again. The curse endured. The whispers would never stop.